Susan Carmani, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this panel discussion on Educate to Eradicate Extremism, what's next in a post-COVID-19 reality. This session is being conducted on the margins of the United Nations General Assembly meetings. And so we have an opportunity here to engage in an issue that is of great importance to the world and thus reflected on the agenda of the United Nations. We're going to have an interactive session today, one in which I will be posing questions to the panelists. I will also be taking some of your questions that you can submit via the chat function, that is to our audience. And so we hope to have more of a conversation than just simply talking at you. Just by way of background, the Hamad bin Khalifa University is part of the Qatar Foundation. Under the leadership of Her Highness Sheikh Mosa bin Nasser, the foundation, through education above all in particular and other initiatives, has been focused on the significance of education, and particularly the right to education under international law. And this is education at all levels, understanding the significance of education in terms of the fabric of our society. It's within the framework of promoting knowledge about education and the significance of education as it relates to two major crises, the pandemic as well as extremism, that we are gathered here today. For the past 7 months, the world has been in various stages of lockdown. We are in fear of an unseen virus with a relatively high transmission rate and life-threatening consequences for many people. Our ability to move freely and to engage in person with others has been radically impaired, and some would say permanently transformed. Nowhere has this been felt more than in the classroom, whether it be education of children or education of adults. At the same time, violent extremism has not subsided. Far-right movements are on the rise in the United States and Europe. Armed groups are active throughout the world. Their calls for violence, their engagement in hate crimes knows no limits. So when we look at violent extremism, we have challenges with a universal definition. We may focus on behavior, yet the ideas themselves, some would argue, such as radicalization, could fit within the definition. UNESCO has published a guide titled Preventing Violent Extremism Through Education, a guide for policymakers. And it does give us some guidance on violent extremism, defining it as beliefs and actions of people who support or use violence to achieve ideological, religious, or political goals. Included is terrorism, as well as other forms of politically motivated and sectarian violence. The United Nations Secretary General has called on a comprehensive approach to deal with conditions giving rise to violent extremism, with a focus on, and I quote, education, skills development, and employment facilitation. So it's with this background that we have gathered a panel of experts to have a conversation about the role of higher education institutions in light of the pandemic and what does this mean for attempts to prevent or counter violent extremism. So let me introduce our distinguished panelists. I'll do so in alphabetical order. First, we have Professor William Braniff, who is the director of the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, and a professor of the practice at the University of Maryland. Professor Braniff previously served as the director of practitioner education at West Point's Combating Terrorism Center, where he also taught there. He is a graduate of West Point and had previously been a foreign affairs specialist at the National Nuclear Security Agency. Also on the panel, we have Dr. Khalid Kozer, who is the Executive Director of the Global Community Engagement and Resilience Fund, a public-private partnership dedicated to preventing violent extremism. He is also a professor of conflict, peace, and security at the University of Maastricht and a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution, Chatham House, and the Lowy Institute. Third, we have Dr. Colette Mazzucchelli, who teaches at New York University in the graduate faculty at NYU, and she focuses on the area of conflict resolution, radicalization and religion, international relations in the post-Cold War era, ethnic conflict, and Europe in the 21st century. She is Senior Vice President of Academia, Global Listening Center, and among her many accomplishments, in 2016, she was named Ambassador of Peace and Recognition of her service as an educator with over 20 years experience in technology-mediated learning. And our final panelist is my colleague, Dr. Leslie Powell, who's the founding dean of the College of Public Policy at Hamad bin Khalifa University. Dr. Powell has authored, co-authored, and edited over 30 books. His most recent book is Global Governance and Muslim Organizations. So first, let me welcome all of our panelists and thank you so much for being with us today to have this important conversation. For the audience, let me just quickly go through a few housekeeping rules. As I indicated earlier, I'll be asking questions and the panelists will be answering those questions, but you in turn have the opportunity to become part of this conversation. So you have a Q&A tab on your, at the bottom of your page. You can click on that and ask your questions. I'll be monitoring the questions as they come in terms of being able to coordinate the timing of asking these questions in terms of the subject matter that we're covering. And so you can see there, our wonderful webmaster Ezzedine has put up on the screen here what your platform should look like and where you should go to click the Q&A to send me a question. And so throughout this session today, we look forward to getting your questions and the like. So hello, everyone, and so glad you're with us. I have just a very first question for all the panelists, and if you could be so kind we can start with Mr. Braniff and go in the alphabetical order in which I just introduced you. But the first question is can you just identify a single way in your judgment in which a higher education institution could help eradicate violent extremism? Mr. Braniff, Professor Braniff, if I may?
Sure, thank you so much for having me. And I'll give the obvious answer, right? Higher education institutions need to inspire students to a lifetime of service, countering violent extremism. At START, we teach a global terrorism studies minor, a graduate certificate in terrorism analysis, and we run a large internship program in which we involve students directly in real-world research. With funding from the Department of State, we're working with higher educational institutions in Southeast Asia to involve students in policy-relevant research on violent extremism. As much as I appreciate the sentiment of eradicating violent extremism is an enduring human phenomenon, and universities will always need to inspire young people to address it over the course of their lives, whether through participation in civil society or government service.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Braniff, for focusing on engagement of students and thinking of it in the long-term context, which I think is absolutely essential, and also introducing your students to extremism around the world. Dr. Koser.
Thank you very much. I agree firstly with William that we are being very ambitious in the use of the term eradicate. I hope we can eradicate, but I think it's a long-term challenge and prevention will be the important first step. I mean, I think to add to what William said, of course, universities have a role to broadcast information, to broadcast knowledge, to inspire young people. But I think often their role begins at home. Certainly the work that we've done here at GSERF, the Global Community Engagement and Resilience Fund, for example, in universities in Bangladesh, finds that sometimes universities themselves can be breeding grounds for violent extremism and for radicalization towards violent extremism. So I think working with universities, with university leaders, such as some of those in this call, to make sure they have their own policies and procedures to guard against radicalization within their own halls is a first step that we need to take in universities. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Kozer, for reminding us that universities can have a very positive function, but also, if not addressed properly, the phrase you use, breeding grounds, and the extent to which this becomes, somewhat of an administrative issue for the university to tackle these issues. Dr. Mazzucchelli, what are your thoughts on a single thing a university can do to help eradicate extremism?
Thank you, Susan. And I would also like to thank President Hasna and all of the colleagues at Hamad bin Khalifa University for the invitation to participate with you today. I agree with both of my colleagues, William and Khalid, in that Eradicate is an ambitious goal. At New York University, of course, we are an evolving global network university. And in that respect, in the vision of President Emeritus John Sexton, we have as our goal to be open to diverse voices, to the many experiences of the human beings around our world. And in this respect, I think that one thing that we can do is to listen to our students around the world and to our partners with whom we engage in this vocation. New York University is relying more than ever in its history on virtual learning. And in this respect, we have the opportunity to bring in local knowledge. And in bringing in that local knowledge in each classroom that is taught virtually, we have the opportunity to learn from the ground up, from the local experience, about the nature of violent extremism, about its roots, about the basic human needs that people have, about their aspirations, and about the way in which the most vulnerable are responding in this time of COVID-19. So I think to listen is very, very important to our students, to our partners, to those whose unique experiences we may include in our learning, to have a more comprehensive, to have a more thorough, to have a more reflective classroom without borders experience. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Mazzucchelli, for that, because listening is critical. And what I thought was also fascinating, it did play into something William said, is the outward nature of the educational function here. And in the case of NYU, the concept of the network, and to be able to interact with institutions around the world, because universities connect with each other and individuals within universities connect with each other, and what that means for each student, administrator, and faculty member. So thank you. Dr. Powell, do you want to chime in on this question?
Sure, I'd love to. Well, thanks as well to all the organizers and my colleagues on the panel for this opportunity to discuss this very important issue. The panelists and perhaps many in the audience will be familiar with the initiatives undertaken around education to counter extreme violence and terrorism. But there may be some people that don't realize that it's a relatively new initiative, a relatively new linkage between education and countering terrorism. The Global Counterterrorism Forum put education as a priority only in 2011. In countering terrorism. The SDGs and the Secretary General that my colleague Dr. Karmanian referred to, that dates back to about 2015. So whereas it may seem relatively obvious that we can try to address, not eradicate, but try to address extremism through education, in terms of global institutions and organized efforts and resources and funding, this is actually a relatively new thing. It's an educational approach to dealing with, and higher educational institutions to dealing with counterterrorism is an educational policy initiative. It's not security oriented. So it's important to recognize that shift. And the point I want to make is, because it's relatively new, we don't actually know that much at this point about what works and what doesn't. So, and again, my colleague, Dr. Susan, referred to the definitional challenges in terms of what counts as extreme terrorism or extreme violence. So one of the contributions I think that higher educational institutions can make, in addition to the ones mentioned by my colleagues, is to do the heavy lifting in terms of evaluation and assessment of impact, of what works. Are we trying to change people's hearts and minds, their ideology? Are we trying to provide skills training, which is a completely different kind of approach to education? Are we building global citizenship? Are we trying to educate people to human rights? And what combination of those educational efforts works best in post-conflict situations in different countries and different contexts? So whereas I think we all agree that it's an important initiative, on the ground, it's really difficult to figure out what works and what doesn't. And I think higher educational institutions can provide a singular service in terms of assessment, evaluation, impact analysis, and research.
Great, thank you so much. I'm gonna go by first names now, Les, my colleague, but I noticed my fellow panelists were doing that, and I think it makes it a little more conducive for a conversation. First, for reminding us that at least the focus has been relatively recent, but secondly, a sense of what is effective. How do we go about measuring what is effective in terms of the impact? And I think that's very important, and of course, spoken like a true public policy expert that you are. So Colette, if I could now just pick up on something that you mentioned in terms of how the universities are able to reach out. One could say that in this time of the COVID crisis, where our doors are shut, the students are not in the hallway, everything is being done online, and we're not having the face-to-face experience other than through this medium. Instead, the universities have become more insular, and the efforts at trying to build social standards and having openness and conversations and the like are limited. What do you say in response to that? That because of the crisis and because universities are basically just online and you don't have the hustle and bustle, that the ability to eradicate or to take steps to eradicate is somewhat impaired.
Thank you for that question, Susan, which I think is a critical one. I preface my remarks by saying that while probably 2/3 of the courses in my programs are online or virtual, there are a few that are in person, and there are others that are hybrid. They're blended, so in person and online. However, you are absolutely correct that the majority are virtual. Now, in my case, right, in the seminars that I teach, and I've been doing this now for almost a quarter of a century, I've found that it's necessary to up the level of the game, meaning that instead of turning in, it's necessary actually to turn more and more outward. And what I mean by that is what I started with, to listen to partners we identify as critical to our learning, to our research, to our service endeavors at NYU. And, you know, that listening, in a way, I think of a spiritual volume, The Listening Life by Adam McHugh. And, you know, he's talking about listening as being something which is a question of obedience, a question of deep listening, a question of listening on the part of the whole person, with one's entire being, with one's heart. And when we do that, we identify certain partners. For example, I'm thinking of Daisy Khan, the Women's Islamic Initiative in Spirituality and Equality. In identifying WISE, we were very careful to note that first, there was an interest in virtual learning expressed by WISE as a partner. Again, a global network. A network, though, that operates very carefully, very locally, with a very, very distinct purpose. And what we've done is we've identified internships for our students with WISE, so that they can actually interact with a partner that's on the ground, with a partner that has knowledge of many different countries, and with a partner that has very, very specific projects. I can mention really one, the creation of a reintegration program for a young woman who was in prison after having been convicted for spreading propaganda in New York last year. She was sentenced to 1.5 years in prison and has subsequently been released this past summer. An NYU candidate is now in the process of creating a reintegration program for this woman that will serve as the basis for other ISIS fighters in the United States so that they can integrate around the United States successfully into society without being a threat to themselves or to others. That's just one example of the way in which we are making a difference in this particular student's life in terms of allowing the student to begin her academic and professional career, working with WISE to create such a program, and also to allow WISE to inform what we do in the classroom, by the nature of its own advocacy before the Congress, before different non-governmental organizations in the United States, in Europe, in Asia, around the world. And in that respect, the focus is always outreach, looking outward, trying to inspire the students, as William said before, but also very practical, giving them concrete projects on which they have to work, relating those projects to their vocation. So the three principles, Susan, that we think of when we think of online learning in the constructivist tradition. Generative learning, the students take responsibility for what they do. Anchored instruction, they relate it to their professional aspirations. And above all, cooperative learning, they work in teams. They are responsible together to think through, to reflect, to propose ideas that can be useful in the university in service to society. And those three principles used in different configurations in the virtual setting allows us to reach out, allows us to encourage encounters. The virtual setting can never replace face-to-face interactions. It is not meant to. It is meant to offer something different. It is meant to give a value added to the university in its quest to serve society. My goal is to deepen that value added. With every course that is taught, we must add something more to the encounters, to the experience, making them more direct, making sure they are of service to society, and making sure that students are implicated in the challenges of our time, the challenge of the pandemic, the challenge of extremism, and of course, the challenge that Shoshana Zuboff identifies of instrumentarian power, which I believe is a great challenge that we face together collectively as humanity, because this is a type of power that seeks to manipulate, that increases the vulnerability of people. And that vulnerability is what makes the young particularly susceptible to recruitment. It is that vulnerability that I think we have to prevent, we have to address, we have to constantly, in our efforts in the university, be on guard against. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colette, for that, because when I first heard you say the importance of course, listening and then the message and obedience, there could be this positive aspect, but there could quickly, as you just finished your remarks, it could quickly turn the other way. And getting back to a comment that Khalid made early on as well. And so, William, you talked about outreach and the like. What mechanisms are you putting in place to address the potential for extremists to harness what Colette just described as being incredibly powerful and take us down a completely different path than what she is describing and her work at NYU?
It's a good question. Let's talk just a little bit about how the information environment during COVID-19, it really works in the favor of extremists, and then think about what we can do about it. Groups like Al-Qaeda and Daesh have argued that the virus is evidence of divine intervention. It's a soldier of God meant to punish non-believers and remind them that countries like the United States are weaker than they might believe and are not to be feared. We see anti-Semitic extremists argue that Jews own the pharmaceutical companies and therefore created the virus in order to benefit financially from selling a vaccine. Anti-government extremists argue that the virus is just a pretext for establishing social controls like martial law, and that governments really just want to inhibit individual freedoms. These are just three examples of how extremists exploit crises to advance their previously held beliefs. including what are often highly conspiratorial beliefs. The pandemic has created high levels of uncertainty, and humans really struggle with uncertainty. When science fails to provide certainty, right? How is the disease transmitted? Why are we seeing some individuals with really strange secondary implications? When will there be a vaccine? Right? When science can't answer questions with certainty, it's really easy for extremists to attack science and offer their ideology up instead, because as we know, extremist ideologies are often very black and white. They provide certainty in an uncertain world. And to exacerbate things, not only are extremists sowing doubts about science and who's to blame for the virus, but hostile foreign influence operations are amplifying this distrust, amplifying the blame. So regarding what to do about this, right, this is a tremendous challenge. So I can only offer a partial solution, right? But a partial solution lies in educational institutions. We have to teach young people to be critical consumers of information online. We have to instill an appreciation for the role of science in improving our lives and challenge students to become ambassadors for science. And we have to teach our students that it's not enough to have the right information if you can't communicate it effectively and influence the behavior of your fellow citizens in positive ways. So really, really difficult to do, but again, over the long haul, it is really our job, I think, to enlist the support of our young people in pushing back on disinformation and valuing expertise and knowledge for what it can do for us all.
Thank you for that, William, because this, I probably, we never thought in our lifetime that we would be having this discussion of the role of science and how there are forces out there trying to undermine what many of us learned when we were going to high school about certain fundamental principles of biology or chemistry and the like. And how to counter that, I think, is challenging when there are very simple general messages that just rely on something pulled out of air, but intuitively somebody could relate to that. And educational institutions, in turn, being devoted to a certain way of studying problems, a scientific method, and the like, and something that from which we shouldn't back away. Kali, do you want to chime in on this? And then we did get a question from one of the members of our audience as well that I will ask after Khalid, if you want to chime in, and Les as well. But I do want to ask this question because it plays into what we've heard so far too. So, but go ahead if you want to chime in.
No, Les, you start, please.
He's on mute.
Yeah, okay, I'm unmuted.
There you go, thank you.
Just a footnote to what William was saying about trust and the respect for scientific method. I mean, one of the remaining or key advantages of higher educational institutions, when you look at all the public opinion polls and what levels of trust are for everyone from politicians to physicians to real estate agents to university professors, and universities come up still pretty high. And I think that's a resource that higher educational institutions should guard very carefully because, we're one of the few remaining, at least in different parts of the world, one of the few remaining institutions that generally can command a default trust, among most of the populace, that people that are working in higher educational institutions are genuinely committed to research, objectivity, a degree of neutrality, balance, fairness, etc. So that's something that we can collectively do and leverage, I think, in ways that other institutions can't.
And Susan, if I could add to that, I agree absolutely. I think public confidence is absolutely critical in this struggle of combating and countering violent extremism. And I think Les is right. In most countries that I know, universities and academics still have confidence. They are seen as objective, committed scientists and not people with a political agenda. I mean, to build on what William said, besides that taking advantage of that confidence to make a political message, I think this echoes something Les said earlier, that universities also have a clear role in really trying to help us understand this field. It's still a relatively new field. It's still lots of people we talk about science, but we haven't got 50 years of health education or education research behind this. We're still fairly unclear about what drives people to radicalization, what the drivers are, how to prevent them, what prevention means, how to measure it. And I think in all those ways as well, universities can add real value in trying to build a field around this area.
Thank you for that, Khalid, because and Les, because of we can study things until we're incredibly focused, but if we can't get the message out, and if we're not the lead, then our credibility, the value of it is diminished. And so the question we have from one of the members of the audience, I think puts this in an interesting light. We're all at universities or institutions that have enormous resources in countries that are very supportive of universities. But one of the questioners asked is what we're talking about here, the role of the university. Will this work in a country? And then the question was, would this work in Somalia? To what extent do we need to be tailoring programs based on specific countries, or are we all looking at universities from a very idealistic viewpoint? And when you have a situation where there could be violence in countries and poverty and the like, are we being realistic in our assessment of universities throughout the world? Colette, do you want to take an effort at that one?
Sure. No, I can definitely start out with that. I mean, I think that realism is essential. NYU does have certain resources, and it has distinct portal campuses, New York, Abu Dhabi, Shanghai, and a whole array of academic centers, many of which are in Europe and then some on other continents as well. What I've tried to do is to partner, for example, with the Syrian Emergency Task Force, which is working to establish schools from the kindergarten up, primary schools in Syria, and to have the students understand the challenges that's entailed in that type of an endeavor. And I think it's only by identifying, again, these partners, those who have a vocation. I mean, the Syrian Emergency Task Force, when I spoke with Muaz Mustafa, Natalie Larison, who is the director of outreach, who's actually in Little Rock, actually Arkansas, but is responsible for outreach throughout the world. When I spoke with her about education, I mean, she was very quick to point out the challenges that the task force faces and how they're trying to support education on the ground. And I think it is a vocation of our university, or at least my courses at NYU, to understand the nature of those challenges and to implicate students in them. That's one way I would suggest that we could try to be sensitive to the challenges on the ground and to be aware of the needs. I think it's a daunting task when we're talking about countries with weak infrastructure, exacerbated by COVID-19. When we're talking about countries with little to no resources. When I first started out, I taught in Budapest, Hungary, on the fringes of the Soros network. I saw firsthand a university that had absolutely no resources. I mean, I was paid in Hungarian forints, so I had the experience of Hungarian professors who had to work 3 and 4 jobs just to make ends meet. It's a very, very difficult environment in higher education in a number of these countries. And I think that we have a vocation, a responsibility to do everything we can to reach out and to try to partner in whatever way we can, according to interests, according to resources, infrastructure-wise. In other words, how much can we do with the infrastructure that we have to reach these particular countries? As we know, not everyone's connected to the internet. Mobile phone access is there, but we have a long way to go before we can really sustain the kinds of connections that make actual courses possible. I do think that should be our goal. I think that we should constantly strive to broaden the grid, constantly strive to be inclusive. I think inclusionism in this respect is essential. We need in education to be more and more inclusive as the challenges rise. And we need to rise to the occasion of the challenges in education in that respect. So I think I'll leave it there, Susan.
Great. And we actually had a follow-up question that was somewhat similar, but touches on something you just said, Colette. And that is, what do we do if a national government or the media just simply doesn't want the youth to learn, that seeks to keep them silent as a way to perhaps exercise control? And at what point do we start thinking of the university or other educational institutions as ways to socialize? How young can the students be? Holly, do you want to share some insight into this?
Sure, thanks very much. I mean, to build on what Colette has said, I mean, clearly there are places in the world where universities are very weak. They just don't have an education infrastructure. And I think we have to recognize that what we're talking about is difficult in those places, although, as Colette says, networks can reach out and we can do some virtual community building. I think the second thing Colette said that I would agree with is that it clearly in some universities, let's be honest, there are greater priorities than preventing violent extremism, like building libraries, like getting students through the doors, like keeping people safe, like feeding people and so on. So I think we need to recognize that. I think the third thing, I suppose I'm slightly less concerned than the questioner about governments that don't want young people to learn, because I think it's very difficult to stop young people learning. I think they will learn and they'll find ways to learn. I'm slightly more concerned, and here I move from the Somalias of the world to some of the rich countries of the world, that I think we still have university administrators who are very nervous about this agenda. This is a politically deeply sensitive agenda. To suggest that there may be a risk that some of the students in your universities may be becoming radicalized. You then get into interesting and difficult debates about how to balance freedom of speech with restricting freedom of speech and those sorts of issues. So I think this isn't just a capacity issue for poorer countries, it's a political issue for richer countries as well.
Great, thank you for drawing that out. And if I could just take just a point of personal privilege to elucidate. I remember back in 1986, I was traveling on my own, and I was in a country, and there was a bicycle rickshaw driver who I was talking to. He had a PhD. He had a PhD in economics. And he said, "Let me sit down and talk to you about what's going on in my country. My country does not want me to become productive, because if I am productive, then I could be a force to counter what is developing in the country." And that affected me in many ways, because I had just got my law degree. And then I started thinking about, at least I was returning to a society in which I was free to work, that I would be valued based on my ability to accomplish things, and there wouldn't be that many restrictions and the like. And it stuck with me. And when I was listening to you, Holly, just make those remarks, and there has since been major developments in that country, and you can't stop people who want to learn and people who want to become productive in their societies. It's very difficult to do that. So I just thought I would share that with you. William, do you have any thoughts specifically on difficult areas? And I think that's probably not even fair to say, because we could have resource-rich countries where the extremism could be developing within the higher education institutions and like.
So it's a really interesting discussion. And instead of maybe offering an opinion, let me just cite an example of where a program has endeavored to work in difficult countries, conflict-ridden countries. It's the P2P program. So this is a program that Facebook has invested in. Over points in time, various US government entities have invested in this program. A company called EdVenture implements this program. And what they do is they involve students in universities across the world, and they challenge the students to come up with their own plans, their own programs to how to on how to push back on violent extremism. They don't tell the students what to do. They don't tell the students what facet of the problem to go tackle. They don't tell the students what they can and can't do. They trust and empower the students to generate some version of a solution for that local context. And the stories that come out of these programs are so inspiring. And so the last thing I think we should do is say, well, no, it's just too difficult to work in a country like Somalia, because that's counting Somalis out. And why would we do that when they have a vested interest in improving the lives for themselves and their friends, right? So just look at the P2P program, and I think it gives you a lot of confidence that we can make change, and we can enable change by empowering individuals at the local level to do locally appropriate things.
Thank you, William. And your observation plays into a question that one of our members of the audience submitted, and that dealt with, are there good practices on the use of technology and digital tools for peace education? You gave us an example. Colette, do you have any ideas on this subject?
Thank you. And I just want to follow on what William has said.
Sure.
NYU participated for 4 consecutive semesters in P2P as a program. That's how much I believed in it for the students. And I believe that still this initiative, which is led, of course, for the Departments of State and Homeland Security by Tony Scrow and Ed Venture Partners, I do believe it is an important initiative for the country and for the world. And that it is one that allows the students to engage with their own creativity, their own initiative, their own teamwork, pulling from the local area, again, what they believe is the essence of a campaign, and then presenting that campaign, really having the communication skills to present that campaign to a larger audience. So I believe William is absolutely right to underline P2P in this context. As far as the use of the tools, I would say yes. And I think it's the selection of the tools and the way in which the selection allows for certain communication to take place. So what I mean by that is, we work a lot with Zoom now on the video conference side. And I've worked with Zoom for almost a decade now in different mentoring capacities. I think it is a very useful video conferencing tool. I think it's important, though, to complement it with a very effective learning management system, because we're not always going to be on a video conference. And in fact, 3 hours, which is a normal graduate session in a video conference, is taxing in a way, as you well know, that it is not when you are in a regular classroom. I can speak, I think, for a number of my colleagues when I say that to hold the attention of young people in a video conference for really more than 20 to 30 minutes takes a considerable amount of talent when it comes to presentation of materials and engaging them. So I think one has to select tools that allow students to cooperate together. This has to be very much a learning experience in a community. The tools have to be used in a way that you bring in students from 4 or 5 continents at the same time, allow them to cooperate together so that each voice is heard individually, and all of those voices resonate in a community. The collective is as important as the individual. And over the course of a 14-week semester, you find that students who did not know themselves in their own context reaching out to other contexts discover new things about themselves. They discover new things about themselves because they're communicating with students in other places on other continents. One learns about oneself more when one communicates with others in different places. And I think having the right tools to allow that to happen is essential. Having the support tools when they are not online, when they are offline, to allow them to continue to communicate is essential. So tools that enhance community building, that allow participation, that enhance the awareness of oneself and others. Those are the types of tools that I think are essential if you want to engage in this type of learning. Thank you.
Susan, can I add?
You bet, Les. Please chime in. I was just going to see if you wanted to say anything, so please do.
And it's actually building on, excuse me, some of the points that were made by William and Colette, but especially when Colette mentioned Central European University in Budapest, where I also taught for a while, not in the beginning days of the university, but later on. But it kind of gets at the issue of how we see higher educational institutions influencing or supporting societal development and governance. I mean, extreme violence and extremism will obviously have a richer seedbed when governance, public institutions, public administration are not working properly or not working well. So there's a kind of more intermediate set of interventions that can sometimes be made in support of countries that are actually still in development phase that may not look like they're necessarily addressing extremism, but they're actually trying to contribute to governance, fairness, stability, effective administration. So, you know, I was involved in the Open Society fellowship programs in Budapest that were trying to kind of build civil society throughout Central and Eastern Europe. Then I ended up working in Sarajevo, where again, it was extraordinary because, I mean, I was working again with the Soros Foundation, but there were university professors who were coming to provide, you know, workshops and assistance on everything from evaluation to public finance to developing policy projects. And so that's a mechanism for higher educational institutions to contribute to the work of foundations and international development agencies and NGOs, of course, on the ground. And it may be aiming at civil society development or governance, good governance, which indirectly can be a way of trying to blunt some of the dissatisfaction or ideologies that will eventually feed into extremism. So it's another pathway that doesn't directly try to address kids in elementary school, for example, but it may eventually get to the same objective.
Great, thanks, Les, for that, and particularly to bringing in to the conversation the importance of support for universities in these in the emerging states, and we've seen what happened in Budapest and the like, and I'm sure many of us are wondering if that couldn't work, how could other institutions work? And this feeds into a question that one of the members of the audience asked, and Khalid, I will address it to you, but again, I think it plays in well with everything we've discussed so far, and that is, what are your thoughts about the relationship between extreme poverty and exclusion to education and the growth of extremism? And this is from a person whose organization works on the front lines of providing access to education in remote parts of the Sahel. And, you know, there are obviously a lot of activity going on there right now. And extremist groups are very active. And she says we have few tools against the physical attacks on schools by extremist groups. And I assume it was a physical, it says the attacks. I assume it was physical, but it could be threats as well and the like.
If that was for me, thanks. I mean, I think, you know, what we found here at GSURF is it's important not to conflate material poverty with spiritual poverty. In some of the communities where we're working, some of the very poorest people are some of the most resilient. They're the champions and they're the change agents in the communities where we're working. Equally, we have found that inequality, marginalization does generate resentment and can make certain people more vulnerable to radicalization. So there clearly is some relationship between economic disempowerment and the risk of becoming more radicalized. I think that the literature is fairly clear on that. But again, I wouldn't want to conflate material with spiritual poverty. Education, I think, is a clearer indicator. And I think we do find in the communities, again, where we're working, that's across 11 countries, 100 or so communities, that education is one way to try to prevent violent extremism. Now, I think that's different from saying uneducated people are more likely to become extremist, but certainly one of the tools for trying to build resilience against extremism is education. And I think we have very clear research to demonstrate that. So there are linkages between poverty and education and radicalization to extremism, but I think they're far more complex than are often assumed. And I come back to the example I mentioned earlier about universities in Bangladesh. I mean, some of the work we are doing finds that some of the people most at risk to radicalization in places like Bangladesh are not the very poorest, they're not peasants, they're people middle class, well educated in universities who appear to not be able to find a future or a meaning in their lives and are being tempted towards radicalization. And Susan, you started by reminding us of the context, which is COVID. And of course, that context makes this more of a challenge. Millions and millions of young people around the world are at least temporarily out of education, are losing their jobs, and probably can't see much of a prospect. And I think that's a fairly poisonous recipe for making at least some people more tempted to be radicalized. And of course, we have the perfect storm. On the one hand, people are becoming less resilient and losing prospects. And at the same time, some violent extremist groups are becoming more active in their radicalization. So I think there's a real conflation of challenges around this at the moment.
It's interesting in that one of our attendees has observed that the extremism is a phenomenon largely intertwined with multiple factors, socioeconomic and political, and also those the extremists, are convinced of their honorable cause. So how you control all those factors and change thoughts, change behavior is ultimately, part of the educational function. Could I shift the conversation a little bit and accept that higher education institutions simply do not control the message here? They do not have a sole monopoly. Instead, we have to look at those that are involved in knowledge creation or dissemination, and that's largely non-state actors, the private sector, social media, religious institutions, and the like. How should we, when we look at their role, how should educational institutions engage with these non-state actors? William?
Sure, hugely important topic. Obviously, there's so much more resources available when you involve whole of society and not just certain sections of society. So private sector entities can be hugely influential in shaping beliefs and behaviors of society more broadly. Through their advertising, they tell a story about their values and about our values. They choose where and how to make capital investments. They have hiring and personnel policies that can enshrine values. And more private sector entities have a great deal of data about all of us. Data which could be used for good or for ill, but could be used very carefully to identify criminality if the companies understand what those signatures of criminality look like. Finally, the private sector plays a critical role with regard to resilience, bouncing back after a crisis like a terrorist attack or a commercial or a terrorist campaign. So the question is, can we get the private sector to understand that it's in their commercial best interest and societal best interest to play an active role in countering violent extremism, right? To enter this fraught political space that Khaled mentioned earlier, to use their influence in this way? And then are they open to scholars working with them to enter this field? And of course, when that doesn't happen, right, you mentioned the media and religious institutions. I just want to highlight this for a second. I mean, both the media and religious institutions, as two examples, they wield tremendous direct influence over how individuals interpret the world around them. They can choose to frame the world as either hostile or tolerant, as inclusive or divisive, as improving or devolving. So let me take US cable news channels to task as an example for a moment. To keep people tuned in to 24/7 news, they have to appeal to their audience's emotions. And I think that the recipe that they've arrived at is 1 part fear and 2 parts righteous anger. Just like extremists who have to first sell you victimhood before assigning blame and selling you violent empowerment, our news channels have now made a fortune by polarizing our nation and then blaming all of the nation's ills on the other. So instead of using their platform to undermine violent extremist narratives, the polarization they produce actually enables violent extremism. And I think we have to figure out as scholars how to get involved in these conversations, how to try to highlight the extremely important role that the private sector can play, either for good or for evil, and not just convince the private sector to wade into this fraught field, but I think we as scholars and educational institutions have to wade into the real world. We have to roll our sleeves up and get our hands a little bit dirty dealing with organizations who have so much sway over our populations.
Great, thank you for that, William, and in particular focusing on the media and the fact that media now is so accessible. Just on our devices, we can get news around the world quickly, and the potential for getting the truth or for getting the message of the moment, the breaking news, to get your attention and things like that. May I ask Khalid or Les or Colette, do you want to chime in on this issue of the role of particularly, religious institutions, corporations, and the fact that they have this enormous influence? What should educational institutions be doing to deal with the development of this phenomenon and the extent to which they are able to shape values and the like?
I can, if you like, I can start, Susan, but I'm sure others have comments. Just to pick up on William's point about the private sector, he's absolutely right. And I think it's been a long-held desire of those of us and others who are working on the field of preventing and countering violent extremism to engage the private sector, but it's proved immensely difficult. And I think the greatest insight I have into why it is so difficult was a couple of years ago when I was with the World Economic Forum in Davos. And I engaged with a couple of CEOs and I said to them, look, I'd like to discuss working with you on countering violent extremism. And they just said, you've just used 3 words, none of which I would ever take into my boardroom: countering, violent, and extremism. These are immensely politically sensitive topics for most corporate leaders. What we have found at GSURF, at least, is clearly there are some sectors that are directly engaged. Social media, clearly, and we know that Facebook is engaging in these issues, I think, quite positively. The extractives are another one. I mean, Total is desperate to try to release the ISIS-held port in northern Mozambique, and there are other examples as well. But to answer your question, my sense is part of the reason that the private sector is nervous about engaging, and indeed engaging more broadly with development and humanitarian and other issues, is that they assume that we are coming to them for more money, and it's just about money. We recently at GSURF did a survey of many of our grantees, and we asked them, what do you actually want from the private sector? Is it money? And the answer was no, it's not money, it's expertise. We want them to lend their expertise to teach us how to do audit, to teach us how to do administration, the sorts of things, to create jobs. It's not just about money. So I think directly what universities could do here is to really help build that bridge. You have corporate leaders who have a misperception about what NGOs want from them. And you have NGOs who don't understand what they can get from corporate leaders, and finding somewhere to bring those two together so that they can find mutually beneficial understandings, I think would be a great research project, or a great way that universities could build that bridge.
And Holly, that's a very interesting observation, because when you look at the big corporate social responsibility movement that has gone on over the past decade, you look at the Ruggie report on the guiding principles for enterprises, and the notion of the engagement of corporations, at least in terms of having human rights, some sense of human rights obligations and the like. And in some companies, you have sophisticated lawyers with human rights backgrounds now that are working in this area. And so the ability of the university to be a place where they could come and have this conversation and to think about standards that could be employed, I think would be, that's an excellent suggestion, and something that I'm going to be, making sort of on my to-do list, because thanks to this medium, I don't have to fly all the way to Redmond, Washington, or bring somebody in from Microsoft here. We could have this conversation with Microsoft just through this medium and the like. Colette or Les, did you want to chime in on this issue as well?
I'll defer to Colette. I'm taking notes.
Well, I just wanted to add on to what's already been said. On Friday, we had a personal data day summit with my colleague, James Felton Keith, and Another colleague of mine, Professor Emeritus C. Ann Hollyfield from the Grady School of Journalism and Mass Communications at the University of Georgia, was also participating. And I think that the university is a part of what has become, again, what Zuboff is terming trading in human futures. The role of the corporation and the way in which personal data is accessed, used, misused, is a fundamental challenge, a fundamental and a scary challenge that we face. The university is only a very, very small part of this ecosystem. And certainly the way the university and human subject research uses data is only a small part of a much, much larger conundrum. And that is the way in which corporations, even more than governments, are using that data. And I think that the university has to be very aware as its human subjects research evolves and as its classroom debate continues virtually as well as in person. We have to encourage healthy debate. We have to encourage, as William said, critical thinking. And above all, we have to be vigilant and on guard with the way in which social media platforms are evolving, and the fact that governments are slow to regulate, if they regulate at all. And in this respect, we have a responsibility in the university, because absent that regulation, the university becomes a check on their power. And in this respect, I would say that the nature of that power is changing. It is more insidious. It is more intrusive. And the younger person is addicted in a way that he or she doesn't even realize. So in that respect, you have the challenge of countering violent extremism, coupled with the addictive practices that are engendered by the devices that we use. And I think when you put those two things together, it is a conundrum that only the university is in a position to address, because the university is responsible to society to guard the nature of the critical thinking and the debate. We have to make sure that that debate continues. That's us, that's on us as educators. And I would say there is no more crucial time for that responsibility to be exercised than now, given what we face: pandemic, personal data abuses, violent extremism. All of these things feed into each other, as you've rightly pointed out. And together they create for us an ecosystem that is truly fragile and very, very vulnerable. In the case of human security, the dignity of the person, that is what I believe is at stake. And that in many ways is what is in question right now. So I think I'll leave it.
Well, yeah, and when you think of your answer in light of just what goes on in the classroom daily and the new rules that we're having to come up with in terms of whether it be tape recording a class like this, and then there's a record of somebody who said something that could be used against them and the like. These are all important challenges that universities simply have to address. Les, did you want to chime in on this subject?
Well, the role of universities in critical thinking is again kind of being picked up by different people, and how we can contribute to fostering debate and exchanges and critical thinking will vary in context by context. And I think it was, various people have mentioned the problems of social media and polarization and the difficulty of actually being able to have open exchanges, even in a classroom. So one of the worries that I've had is, looking at universities around the world, in Western Europe and North America, maybe the problems were not so acute in the past in terms of the way in which open debate might be constrained or limited in comparison to some other parts of the world. But it's been rising, it's been challenging, it's been more difficult, I think. So it is a vocation. It is one of the most important contributions of higher educational institutions to maintain that space for people to have open exchanges and feel that they can talk to each other about the most important issues. And because there are increasingly fewer places where you can do that openly and with trust and comfort with your interlocutors. Again, the social media contribution that William and others have mentioned has just poisoned the kind of public debates that are possible these days. So that's something we need to grapple with, and something we need to, as higher educational institutions, make a singular contribution to.
Great. A question came in that takes us a bit back to more of just looking at the role of the university, but I'm curious about reactions from the panel, and maybe it does play on the way we're looking at the role of business too. But that is that the need for universities, even in the context of engineering and sciences, to think of encouraging their students to become global citizens and to take global views on critical issues and the like. Is that something, do you think, at least in the context of dealing with violent extremism, is well worth our time? Because as I'm sure many of you know, in higher education institutions, there's enormous focus on STEM these days. Are we losing opportunities because of that? Are we becoming so narrowly focused on algorithms to resolve problems that we're not thinking of the societal implications of that? Holly, did you want to chime in on that, or Les as well? Please.
Yeah, let me jump in, and it's a bit of a plug for HBKU and Qatar Foundation, but I hope people will forgive me for that. But as Susan knows, the College of Law, but it's been led by the College of Islamic Studies, and the College of Public Policy have been participating in this as well, was just awarded a multi-million-dollar grant on SDGs and global citizenship. So it's the grant and the project, which is, has, I think, over 8 different principal investigators looking at human rights education, the concept of global citizenship, best practices and standards, and trying to foster and support a notion of global citizenship. This is a big effort. It's not intrinsically, and it wasn't framed as something to deal with extremism, but it is trying to make a contribution to our thinking about these issues. It's trying to make a contribution to how the country of Qatar can actually position itself and use its soft power or its nested power in its various activities internationally and globally. And both the Qatar Foundation and the country itself nationally, in terms of foreign policy, have been very active in development and human development issues and educational support, as you know, the QF in particular. So it's a great example of exactly that. When you said global citizenship, I thought here's a sterling example of a real live initiative that's supported by research resources here at Qatar Foundation, through the university, partnering with government, local and community organizations, and trying to build a space and a set of resources for us to think about global citizenship, but to take that out into the wider world and help support the development of a broader concept, I guess. I mean, this maybe sounds a bit romantic, but a broader concept of humanity and what our ties and bonds are to each other.
Great, thank you. William, did you have your hand up? I thought I saw a signal from you on that, but I was going to go to colleague, but okay. Kali, did you want to chime in on this in terms of global citizenship in universities and the like?
Sure. I mean, unlike the other panelists, I'm not teaching in the classroom day to day, so they'll know more about universities than me, although I'm, as you noticed, a professor in the University of Maastricht. But I mean, absolutely, whenever I teach and have taught my academic career, making young people global citizens is part of our purpose. I think it's part of our purpose as teachers and university administrators and professors. I just riff off that concept of global citizenship to make this point. I think lots of young people are global citizens when it comes to the challenges of inequality or the challenges of climate change, for example. I still don't think that preventing violent extremism or countering violent extremism is seen as a global public good. I think if you spoke to most students in most universities that I know, at least, and admittedly, I'm not teaching in Kenya and other countries that are directly affected, perhaps, but I'm not sure that they would list in their top 10 challenges preventing violent extremism. So I think global citizenship, but trying to get this particular issue onto the agenda, I think is important. And for me, the conceptual challenge is how and when does an issue become a global public good? When do we begin to realize that preventing violent extremism is not just in my national security interests or not just in my extractive industries business, but actually helps the entire world to be a better place and actually is deeply related with gender equality and solving challenges around conflict and so on. And I think getting this on the agenda in that way will be important to really leverage the global citizenship concept.
Great, thank you. And that plays into sort of a third area I'd like to focus on, and that is just in terms of governance. And you talked about how, and we've heard about how this hasn't been on the agenda till lately, and now we heard it's not perceived to be a public good. It's difficult for states, Khalid, to come together and reach agreements, particularly through, for example, at the multilateral level. What role is there for the United Nations or other international institutions to provide support for higher educational institutions to help address these issues? And as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, Her Highness has been active in this in terms of supporting in her work on education from above all. We've heard of other initiatives as well. But are we in a point where it's on a state-by-state bilateral basis, but the international institutions are powerless, or what?
I mean, my colleagues will have opinions as well. I think I would still characterize this largely as a state-driven bilateral pursuit. I think violent extremism is still largely seen through a national security lens, and we can argue whether that's appropriate or not, but I think that's a reality. But I don't think we should overlook the fact that there has been some quite innovative cooperation between states over the last few years. Les mentioned the Global Counterterrorism Forum. Now, one can criticize that or not, but it is nevertheless an informal gathering, I think of 35 states or so from around the world that are looking at this challenge from a whole variety of perspectives: gender, prevention, countering more hard security. And I think GCTF has had limited but significant successes, again, given it's a very politically sensitive field. We have to recognize that certainly in the last 5 years or so, the United Nations has become more active. We have the UN Plan of Action on Preventing Violent Extremism. We have the new UN Office of Counterterrorism, I think very generously supported by the state of Qatar. Various UN agencies, UNESCO, UN Women, UNDP, and so on, are becoming more engaged. So certainly compared to 5 years ago, when the UN really was struggling to get a grip on this and was struggling about definitions and was just too politically locked to do anything, I think we are seeing progress at some sort of multilateral level. My own modest organization, GSERF, is another example of a multilateral effort focusing on prevention. So those are good signs, but I think there are some still significant gaps. I think the states and the multilateral organizations are missing some important pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. Certainly, I don't think enough has been done to engage the private sector. And again, it's not just about money, it's about expertise and leveraging that. As we've discussed, I don't think enough has been done to leverage the power of universities, and I think that's a real gap. UNESCO has done a few things, but I think they're rather ad hoc. And I would argue there's still a gap around local communities. And I think in one way or another, we've discussed that, the way that it's often at the local community level that both the challenges are identifiable and the solutions may be identified as well. So bridging that gap between state responses and local communities, I think, remains a gap that we have to work on. Now, what can states do directly to promote cooperation and to promote universities to do the sorts of things we're talking about? Well, I mean, of course, states do have levers. States largely fund universities. I wouldn't want to go down that road, but states do have some control over not what's taught in the classroom, but certainly how universities are administered. And I think there's some discussion to have around that. As I said, very politically sensitive, certainly in the countries that I know, university administrators and government officials trying to work out the trade-off between freedom of expression with restricting certain expressions and ideas. I have more faith in the sorts of things that Colette spoke about at the beginning when she spoke about New York University and the university networks that exist already around the world. I think universities can do this by themselves with creative networks. We've spoken about students, and I think that's even more important. I think students can do this. We've spoken about the risks of social media and the risk of a sort of global community of people who may be being misled, but I would be more positive. I think the global community of people is largely being informed and supportive. And if you want global citizenship, I think online interaction between students is the way to try to achieve it. I think the final thing I'd say here is that I was very interested. Colette mentioned a very specific example of a program, as I understood it, in New York about the reintegration of somebody. Now, you know, GSERV's doing similar work on the reintegration of foreign terrorist fighters in the Western Balkans and Tunisia. And it seems to me that there's lots of individual examples taking place around the world, but no one's really collated them and learnt the lessons. It seems to me that would be a role for universities to play. That might be a role for the UN to play as well. This isn't an empty field. There are things happening. There are great ideas out there, but we still haven't worked out the way to sort of bring them all together. And I think that's a challenge that we need to confront quickly. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kelly, for that. And Les, that plays right in your area of work in terms of gathering that information and assessing it and the like. Do others want to chime in on I think what is Khalid has given us a lot to think about in terms of where we have gaps and ways in which they can perhaps be addressed. Colette, do you want to chime in?
Oh, sure. Well, I agree with what Khalid has said about the need to collate. And I think that is a challenge that we face within the university world. NYU, for example, is quite decentralized, understandably so. So it becomes a question of organization, coordination, and above all, leadership. And one thing about leadership is that it can't be automated. So in our world today, we need a very special type, I think, of university leadership and a very special type of global leadership to address these concerns and these challenges. And I would say that leadership would need to be informed first and foremost by the sensitivity to what is at stake. I agree with Khalid. I don't think that this subject is viewed as part of the global commons per se. And I think that is a tremendous omission. It's a sin of omission rather than a sin of commission. I think that the way in which I and my colleagues, the way we try to approach this is we bring together an eclectic cohort. So for example, I'll give you an example. Dr. Anna Grichting is an architect, and she's a member of our group. She's done a lot of work in your region of the world, actually, as an architect. And we've been discussing a lot the question of spaces that can be intruded upon, can be, shall we say, penetrated by extremists. And places that need to be constructed, places that are resilient, places that have both an infrastructure architecture as well as a spiritual resonance, two things going together. The place is the foundation of community. And I think to go from a space that is vulnerable, a space that is weak, to a place that is a foundation for community, that is the challenge of the architect and the engineer. Now, if I wasn't a professor, I would have been an architect. That was my second goal, okay. I became a professor with the aim of working with architects because I believe that in their design thinking and in the way they see what it is that they envision, there's a concrete nature to what they do that makes an idea possible. And I'm for the realization of the potential of the idea. So I think we need to take some of the ideas that Khalid and William have shared, and I think we need to realize them. And I think to do that, you need engineers, you need architects, you need educators. It takes a village. I think this conversation is fascinating because you're creating the village. I think, Les is taking his notes, and I think those notes might become the basis for the village. So thank you, Les.
Yeah, Les and I are very fortunate to be an education city, which I think in its design, Colette, is well thought out as a place where people can come gather. There's space. It is just architecturally spectacular in terms of the way you feel when you are in Education City. And when I was listening to you, and this is not to provoke an answer of any sense now, because there was maybe a few others want to chime in on this, but I'm thinking the relevance of buildings going forward in light of COVID. And are the architects going to be the ones that are dealing with this platform and making it more of a welcome place and a feeling of the spiritual feeling I get when I'm in Education City, whether that will be the future, and I hope not. I hope not, for the reasons that you just described. William and Les or Khalid, do you want to chime in as well on this issue?
Sure. I think I'm not even sure exactly what issue we're still on, but this is very, it demonstrates, I think, how interrelated the topic of violent extremism is with everything else, because it's a human phenomenon, and it's a social phenomenon. It's a political phenomenon. It's criminal. I mean, it's very difficult to extract it from everything else that we care about. I want to go back to the point about measurement and evaluation of efforts of data collection and documenting lessons learned. It's very easy to say. From a very pragmatic standpoint, right? There are organizations that have sought to do this. My organization collects something called the Global Terrorism Database. Very simple idea. We try to document every terrorist attack around the world. It is exceedingly difficult to fund this simple data collection effort, despite the fact that it is exceedingly well utilized, right? This is a data set that's downloaded 1,000 times a month. It is used across the world by governments. It's the most comprehensive source of terrorism data in the world, and it can be used for risk assessments, for protecting our communities, for designing programs and locating those programs. And yet I struggle to fund it. And so I think while we know that these ideas sound really good, pragmatically, we have to care enough about them collectively to fund them. And then to fund the organizations that do it, to disseminate that information as widely as possible. It shouldn't be hard, but it is. Just as someone who's been on the problem-solving end of how to sustain these efforts, we would love to have a data set on terrorism prevention initiatives around the world, and to characterize what their theories of change are, what their medium and long-term goals are, and then try to do selective measurement and evaluation of those efforts so we could collectively learn something and then disseminate that knowledge, right? As a research center based in a university, we would love nothing more than to do that. The question is, someone has to be willing to fund it for the long term, not once, not for 1 year, but for the long run if we're really going to be serious about this. And frankly, that's been hard to come by, that kind of support.
Well, that's interesting in terms of the fact that, unless you may want to chime in on this, the fact that there are gathering this data and the like, and of course the cost associated with that, and ways in which perhaps the private sector and others could, or governments could support this. Obviously, you would need to be able to continue to do your work free of any influence and the like. But I don't know, Les, if you have any, because I know you work in the assessment world. Any thoughts on that?
Well, part of it is not just funding, though William's point is absolutely correct. I mean, finding the funding to support that kind of data collection and analysis is important. What we're finding here, I mean, being here, is there's also a capacity building component to this. I mean, doing robust and rigorous evaluations of interventions is not an easy thing to do. I mean, it requires certain technical skills and different, I mean, not ironically, but the very places in the world that tend to be most afflicted by extremist violence, turmoil, turbulence, internal social and political conflict are the ones where, again, the capacity to do this kind of work is often minimal. So one of the initiatives that we're undertaking here, again, I'm sorry for what sounds like another plug, but undertaking here is to develop some educational programs around program evaluation so that we can build up the capacities, not just within the country, but within the region more generally. So that's another angle on what William's putting his finger on is, the kind of work that's undertaken by universities in gathering data, and also the kind of work that's done by universities in supporting the capacity building around effective evaluations.
Great. Well, thank you, Les. One topic that we didn't have time to touch on is something that is of interest to me is, and Kali just briefly alluded to it, is the potential legal constraints that come into play here, because invariably when you look at attempts to deal with extremism, you are going to deal with freedom of expression as well as religious freedom. Those are the two principal freedoms. There are many other human rights that are implicated. And the United Nations has a special rapporteur who is focused on this issue. And just as at least my final words before I pass the floor over to my colleague, Les Powell, is to think about in the work of states or even within the work of institutions to make sure that we use a human rights framework, that we use the minimal intrusive measures, the least restrictive in terms of affecting human rights, that we have committees in place to give human rights assessments before decisions are quickly made and alike. So that's just part of the conversation. A big part of the conversation we weren't able to touch on today, but at least I feel as a lawyer compelled to make reference to that. At this point, I would like to pass the floor over to my colleague, Les Powell, and again, William and Khalid, thank you so much, and Les as well. So the floor is yours, Les.
Thank you very much. Well, the division of labor has been for Susan to be the stage manager in our discussion in our panel, and for me to serve as a kind of rapporteur in the last few minutes. Now, of course, with a discussion as rich and as detailed and as complicated as the one that we've had, it's going to be difficult to try to capture all of the major themes. So I'll ask your indulgence, the panelists as well as the audience, if I miss anything that they thought was important. But it seemed to me that the conversation that we've had over the last hour and a half breaks down into two broad categories. One is about the context, and the second is a range of solutions to how we can tackle, through educational institutions and higher educational institutions in particular, extreme violence and terrorism. So on the context, obviously, front and center is COVID and the pandemic and its impact. And there were several points that were raised, I think, by different panelists on that. The economic impact, the closures, going online for universities, living our lives much more digitally and separately than we have before. But there were a couple of kind of threats that I think bubbled up in the discussion that are part and parcel of this new context. Some of these are not entirely new, but they've been affected by COVID. So one was, and several people mentioned this, the impact of social media in exacerbating the debates and contexts and arguments that people have. Though Khalid, I think, also tried to inject a more hopeful note as to the capacities of social media and what it can help us do. The economic impact of COVID and the pandemic. And again, Khalid, if I may cite him, reminded us not to think about the economic impact just in terms of material benefits, but also to see some aspect of spiritual poverty versus economic poverty. And then William at the very beginning mentioned in connection with social media, but just the kinds of, again, heightening of conspiracy theories that play on extremist views, but also give them the capacity to actually magnify their theories and their perspectives, and then use social media as a channel. So the context is really challenging and very much affected by COVID and the pandemic. Now, solutions, and everybody right from the beginning said, we're not going to eradicate. I mean, there's no silver bullet here in any way, shape, or form, but there were some suggestions and discussions about what we might want to do, and I'll go through them very quickly because we're almost out of time. Networks and partnerships, and using the networks among universities and higher educational institutions. Again, Colette mentioned this in terms of WISE, but universities have a unique global network structure that I think they can leverage and try to use to address these issues. We also mentioned partnerships with the private sector, P2P, NGOs, foundations. So the networking, partnership, international organizations is one cluster of ways of addressing. Second point was in educating people, in educating students in particular, drawing on them as active learners and participants in what they're doing, concrete projects that are locally informed so that they can address issues that are concrete and pertinent to their own context is very important. And critical thinking also as part of the educational mission of higher educational institutions. A third kind of set of discussions around solutions was tools and best practices. And Colette mentioned, we're using Zoom, we're using these digital technologies, but also learning management systems is really important. And then Susan in her closing remarks mentioned human rights frameworks and human rights education as something that we can do and draw on. Another area was, and the one that I played on, but several people chimed in on as well, is the importance of evaluation, measuring, assessing impact, trying to learn, get best lessons, learn lessons from different interventions, and that played or reflects the point that William was making about funding these kinds of efforts. And a fifth one is, I'm almost finished. The fifth one, which came up in various remarks, but it wasn't the main theme, but I thought it was quite interesting. Several of you mentioned resilience, and building and supporting resilience. Resilience as a preventative measure, resilience as a way of being able to resist and respond to extremists. So, I mean, resilience at an individual level in terms of the kind of education we provide, resilience, and I will work it in, Colette, you'll be happy, building the village, the kind of community, social resilience that can be built as a bulwark against extremist appeals. So all to say, those are tools and instruments that we might be able to use. We're never going to eradicate. It's going to be an ongoing problem, but it's something that's obviously of sufficient importance that we need to move it onto the global public agenda and have it addressed in a variety of ways. My last happy function is to thank everyone on the panel, to thank QF, to thank HBKU, our various colleagues that help organize this, to very much extend our collective thanks to the audience for their participation and their support. And we look forward to continuing this discussion and working together collectively to try to address this very difficult and challenging problem. So thank you all.